Japanese-sponsored republic. So nagkaroon lang ng konting panahon o taon ang pananakop na napasailalim tayo sa kamay ng mga Amerikano dahil dumating na rin ang mananakop na Hapones dito sa Pilipinas. So even the Commonwealth government was again a brief interlude with the advent of the Japanese, which paved the way for the institution in the country of the Japanese-sponsored republic with Jose P. Laurel as their president. The same was formally established on October 14, 1943 amidst the uncertainty and the hopelessness under Quezon's in exile. But the same was proclaimed dissolved no less than by the President Laurel himself on August 17, 1945. So the invasion of the Japanese to the Philippines started on 8th of December 1941, 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. As at Pearl Harbor, American aircraft were severely damaged in the initial Japanese attack. Lacking air cover, the American Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines withdrew to Java on 12 December 1941. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered out, leaving his men at Corridor on the night of 11 March 1942 for Australia, 4,000 kilometers away. The 76,000 starving and sick American and Filipino defenders in Bataan surrendered on 9 of April 1942 and were forced to endure the infamous Bataan Death March, on which 7,000 to 10,000 died or were murdered. The 13,000 survivors on Corridor surrendered on 6 of May. Jose Paciano Laurel y Garcia, commonly known as Jose P. Laurel, was a Filipino politician and a judge. He was the president of the Second Philippine Republic, a Japanese puppet state. So kilala siya bilang puppet president under the Japanese regime. So the Japanese during World War was conducted in 1943 to 1945. Japan occupied the Philippines for over 3 years until they surrendered. So the dissolution of the Japanese-sponsored republic was appealed to the American forces, liberating the Philippines from the Japanese under command of the military general of his time, General Douglas MacArthur, who immediately restored the Commonwealth government on October 23, 1944, under heavy fight with the enemy. So this means a highly effective guerrilla campaign by Philippine resistance forces controlled 60% of the island, because the Philippines are comprises of different types of islands, mostly jungle and mountain areas. So MacArthur supplied them by submarine and sent reinforcement and officers. Filipino remained loyal to the US, partly because of the American guarantee of independence, and also because the Japanese had pressed large numbers of Filipinos into work details and even put young Filipino women into a brutal slave. So General Douglas MacArthur kept his promise to return to the Philippines on 20 of October 1944. So nakilala natin si General Douglas MacArthur sa quotation niya na "I shall return." The landings of the island of Leyte were accompanied by a force of 700 vessels and 174,000 men. Through December 1944, the island of Leyte and Mindoro were cleared of Japanese soldiers. During the campaign, the Imperial Japanese Army conducted a suicidal defense of the island. Cities such as Manila were reduced to rubble. So in the end, no, natalo din ng mga American yung mga Hapones na paalis sila dito sa Pilipinas. So the restoration of the Philippine Commonwealth paved the way for the declaration of the Philippine Republic on July 4, 1946, as originally envisioned in the Tidings-McDuffie Law, with a 10-year transition period in place. Hence, the rebuilding of the nation from the rubble of war was left entirely to the Philippine government, plagued with economic destruction, low moral and politically divided citizenry between the democratic and communist ideologies. So, it means to say, after the war in the Philippines, the Commonwealth was restored, and a 1-year transitional period in preparation for our independence, wherein also the Filipino people began to rebuild their ruined country in preparation for independence. Immediate free relief operations are already underway in combat areas in the Philippines. And behind the lines, the army is conducting a sale relief to supply the people with basic needs. Restoration of necessary public works has been undertaken by the army on a temporary basis. So, on the other hand, low moral and politically divided citizenry between the democratic and communist ideologies that lead to the communist movement. So, dito na po yung communism, no? Dito rin nabuo yung pagtatayo ng New People's Army na hanggang ngayon ay nag-exist pa rin. So the communist movement has had multiple periods of popularity and relevance to the national affairs of our country, most notably during the Second World War and the martial law era of the Philippines. So currently, the communist movement underground and considered an insurgent movement by the armed forces of the Philippines. So, ibig sabihin ng insurgent movement ng communist movement, no? Ibig sabihin nito, pinutubis nila yung gobyerno. So, gusto nilang i-overthrow yung government. Yun yung isa sa mga adhikain ng mga komunista. So, ibig sabihin dahil sa matinding hirap na dinanas ng mga Pilipino sa post-war era, nahati ang kanilang kaisipan sa dalawa higit pa. Ang iba ay sinunod ang demokratikong sistema ng government, ngunit meron pa ring bumuo ng rebellion na may adhikain na palitan ang gobyerno or to overthrow the government. So, dahil dito, ang communist movement ay kinilala ng AFP or Armed Forces of the Philippines. So bilang kilusang komunista na may adhikain at layunin na sumalungat sa kagustuhan at sistemang pinapatupad ng gobyerno sa panahong iyon. So the former look up the American idealism of democratic life with its accrued freedom from wants, thereby constituted merely of the elite members of the society, while the latter, who constituted the majority poor, mostly peasants, and exploited industrial workers, look up communism as their only way out the poverty with the use of armed struggles. So thus we had hukbalahap in the mid-50s, o mas kilala sa tawag na Hukbong Bayan laban sa Hapon, na kilala bilang samahan ng mga gerilya na lumaban sa mga Hapon noong panahon ng digmaan. So ito ay binubuo ng mga magsasaka at mga komunista sa Pilipinas na pinamumunuan ni Luis Tarok. And lately, the NPA in the 60s founded on March 29, 1969 by the collaboration of Jose Maria Sison and former member of Hukbong Bayan Bernabe Buscaino. Ninoy Aquino's house with his supervision. So dahil dito, there are rumors, no? Masasabi rin sa kasaysayan na ang utak ng NPA ay ang namayapang si Benigno Ninoy Aquino, na asawa ng late President Cory Aquino. So the NPA is one of the key figures in the ongoing communist rebellion in the Philippines up to the present until now, together with the MNLF, MILF, BIFF, Abu Sayyaf, and the latest ISIS group in Mindanao. Kilala natin yung ISIS, no? Sa Mindanao, sila yung nagsimula ng battle in Marawi na nangyari sa Marawi City sa Mindanao region. These are groups and their labor and counterpart has greatly prejudiced our fight, political and economic instability. So dahil dito sa mga communist group, medyo napabagal ang unlad ng ating ekonomiya because of their opposite philosophical ideologies against the government. Next, we have the political reforms. So the height of communist struggle both in the country and urban sector, with the universities being penetrated and the youth, especially the student sectors, anywhere in the Philippines demanding for political reforms, particularly against corruption in the government-induced what is known in the Philippine history as the first quarter storm, fought mostly in the university belt. So in addition to this, the first quarter storm is often shortened into acronym FQS, was a period of civil unrest in the Philippines which took place during the first quarter of the year 1970. It included a series of demonstrations, protests, and marches against the administration. So iba't ibang demonstration o protesta laban sa kasalukuyang gobyerno noong panahong pamuno ni President Ferdinand Marcos, mostly organized by students from January 26 to March 17, 1970. So gusto nilang baguhin yung kasulukuyang administrasyon sa pamumuno ni President Ferdinand Marcos na nakilala nila bilang isang presidenteng diktador noong panahon yun. It creates political reforms therefore. Isa sa mga dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng first quarter storm with the power of the student, no, because of the influence of the communist group, no, sila yung nag-recruit ng mga student para sumali sa kanilang adhikain na kontrahin ang kasalukuyang government na pinamumunuan ni President Ferdinand Marcos. Political reforms was characterized by chaotic student rallies and demonstration coupled with indiscriminate and equally chaotic labor strikes in the industrial sectors, joined by the peasant clamoring for agrarian reforms against landlords and hacienderos in the countryside. The student moderates, which still dominated the university belt, demanded for the rewriting of the 1935 Philippine Constitution, which they allege as anti-Filipinos, being the legacy of the American vested interests in the Philippines. Gusto nilang baguhin, no, yung kasalukuyang institusyon na pinamana sa atin ng mga Amerikano, yung 1935 Philippine Constitution. So in this type of demonstration or protest with political reforms, so violent dispersals of various protests were among the first watershed events in which large numbers of Filipino students of the 1970s were radicalized against the Marcos administration. So due to this dispersal, many students who had previously held moderate position, for example, calling for legislative reforms, pagbabago sa pamamahala sa gobyerno, became convinced that they had no choice but to call for more radical social change na tinatawag. So adhikain ng mga students na to yung land reform, yung pagbabago sa constitution. Let us proceed to framing of 1973 Philippine Constitution. Amidst prevailing chaos of the first quarter storm, President Ferdinand E. Marcos called for the 1971 Constitutional Convention to rewrite the 1935 Philippine Constitution. So, na-revise or nabago yung dating Constitution na 1935 to turn into 1971 Constitutional Convention sa pamumuno ni Ferdinand E. Marcos. So in the process, however, the convention was marred with the Payola scandal, with one delegate by the name Eduardo Quintero accusing Marcos men of distributing Payola envelopes to ensure the insertion of parliamentary type of government in the 1973 Constitution so that Marcos would remain the chief executive of the land beyond 1973 as Prime Minister, since his term as President would end in 1973. So, ibig sabihin, sekretong ipinapatupad ng pamahalaang Marcos yung pagbabago sa Philippine Constitution, at dahil dito sa pagbabagong ito, meron silang ginawang plano na to turn our constitution as the insertion of parliament government na halal sa kanya bilang isang prime minister ng Pilipinas. The said scandal angered all sectors of the Filipino society, which culminated the first quarter storm into a semi-revolt atmosphere, especially in Metro Manila. The euphoric political upheaval prompted then the President Marcos to proclaim martial law over the entire Philippines on September 21, 1972, according to save the Republic to form a new society with his historical proclamation 1081. So because of the first quarter storm, nag-create nabuo yung anarkiya. Ibig sabihin yung mga tao hindi na sumusunod sa pinapatupad na batas or sa pamumuno ng gobyerno. So napilitang mag-proclaim or magproklama ng martial law si late President Ferdinand E. Marcos because of the new society, to form a new society with his historical proclamation of 1081 under martial law. Thus, with the proclamation of martial law and with the opposition either put behind bars or escaped to exile, with some practically missing, convention in submission to martial law completed the 1973 Philippine Constitution. President Marcos, with haste and unprecedented approach, with the use of his martial law power, had the same approved by a barangay assembly on January 17, 1973. Said approval was questioned before the Supreme Court, the same being in violation of the amendments provision in the 1935 Constitution. The Supreme Court, however, in what appeared to be a vacillating decision, said that since there was already acquiescence on the part of the Filipino people, there was no more judicial obstacle for its enforcement. So in our country, we have a total of 6 constitution. The constitution ay mas kilala sa tawag na Saligang Batas ng Pilipinas. It also includes how powerful a country is. So the 1973 Philippine Constitution started when President Marcos re-elected because of his desires to remain in power beyond his legal tenure. So lumampas na siya sa kanyang termino because of this 1973 Philippine Constitution. So naipagpatuloy niya yung pamumuno niya sa Pilipinas under the Proclamation 1081, the martial law. So he declared martial law in 1972 bago pa matapos ang pamumuno niya para mas magbigay ng power sa kanya or ma-activate agad. He then manipulated going Constitutional Convention at ito ay nagiging resulta sa pagkakabuo ng the 1973 Constitution, which allowed him to rule by decree until 1978. Martial law era. Martial law era was made possible with several amendments in 1973 Constitution and the Supreme Court's pronouncement that the same was political question and therefore beyond the jurisdiction of the court. Hence, prolonging martial law had become absolutely discretionary upon President Marcos, with his dictatorial rule and the military arm as the primary executor and implementer. So the Proclamation 1081, which placed the entire Philippines under martial law, was signed by our former President Ferdinand Marcos. There are lots of amendments in the 1973 Constitution and the Supreme Court pronouncement because of this martial law. So under this proclamation, the Court of Appeal doesn't have the official power to make any decision. Because of martial law, President Marcos has the will to use it upon also the supervision of the armed forces or the military arm to execute or to put into effect ang nasabing batas. The martial law era was characterized with terror, cronyism, and with people incarcerated, missing, or seen salvage. So, because of this martial law, unti-unting na-violate yung human rights. So, the rich opposition live in exile, while the poor who oppose the martial law joined the NPA or the New People's Army. But the mute and submissive majority live in submission, hoping that martial law would somehow bring a difference in terms of improving their lives under the reformed society with disciplined citizenry as promised. So meron pa rin ilang mga Pilipino ang umaasa na mababago ang sistema ng buhay nila because of this martial law. But majority of the Filipino joined the NPA, the New People's Army, revolt against this present administration under the late President Ferdinand Marcos. In its entirety, martial law was a failure which brought so much hardship to the majority, while the few, especially the Marcos crony, amazed with wealth. The falling health of Marcos and the power struggle between Imelda Marcos, the wife of the President Marcos, and the one Ponce Enrile, then the defense minister, and perceived number 2 main in martial law as to who would be the next president to replace President Marcos, together with the rampant abuses of military weakened martial law. NPA was gaining membership and so was the MNLF in Mindanao under Nur Miswari. The political elite continued their fight abroad. The Philippine Constabulary, now Philippine National Police or the PNP, was loyal to General Fidel B. Ramos. The armed forces was divided between General Fabian Ver Imelda, loyalists, and Juan Ponce Enrile, with the young officers headed by Colonel Gringo Hunasan under his reform, the armed forces movement. And the disgruntled ground commanders felt being exploited by the people on top. EDSA Revolution. EDSA Revolution began by the killing of Benigno Aquino Jr., famous known as Ninoy, at Tarmac Naiya upon his return on August 21, 1983. So si late Benigno Aquino Jr. na mas kilala natin sa pangalang Ninoy, ang isa talaga sa tumaliksa or nag-criticize ng pamumuno ng late President Ferdinand E. Marcos. There are some rumors na si Marcos yung nasa likod ng pagpatay kay Benigno Aquino Jr. pero hanggang sa ngayon, di pa rin nare-resolba ang kasong ito. Facilitated down the fall of martial law, for Ninoy was considered the national symbol of anti-martial law movement. So yung pagkamatay niya, no? Yun yung pumukaw sa damdamin ng mga tao na pabagsakin na ang diktadoryang Marcos. The people in unison condemned the killing and with courage attended his funeral in peace defiance of martial law. The start of EDSA Revolution. The killing of Benigno Aquino Jr. or mas kilala bilang si Ninoy at the Tarmac Naiya upon his return on August 21, 1983 facilitated the downfall of martial law. For Ninoy was considered the national symbol of anti-martial law movement. So yung pagkamatay ni Ninoy Aquino, na kilalang aggressive leader who together with the intellectual leader Senator Jose Diokno lead the overall opposition para mapabagsak ang rehimeng Marcos. Shortly after the imposition of martial law, Aquino was arrested in 1972 because of murder case and subversion, which means he systematically attempt to overthrow the government, and along with others associated with the New People's Army, armed insurgency, and incarcerated for 7 years. So upon the death of Benigno Aquino Jr., the people condemned the killing and with courage attended his funeral in peaceful defiance of martial law. Thus, the President Reagan, in attempt to save Marcos' rule without harming his posture as champion of democracy. Because of this falling of Marcos' administration, President Reagan, the 40th President of the US, made an attempt to save Marcos' rule without harming his posture as champion of democracy. Pressured Marcos to install democratic reforms in terms of mock election, liberalizing his rule. Thereby, pataang pambansa was installed. Martial law was lifted at least on papers and allowing rallies and demonstrations against dictatorship. Cory Aquino, the wife of Ninoy, took his place as the national opposition leader to condemn martial law openly, publicly, and vigorously. So in addition to this, the Reagan administration came to power to convince the Marcos regime to end martial law. President Marcos formally ended 80 years of martial law on the eve of Reagan's democratic concern. The euphoric demand or the exercise for democracy from all quarters to give justice to Ninoy and to Marcos' rule prompted the US to demand upon Marcos to call for a snap election on February 6, 1986 as a precondition to continue the US support of Marcos' martial law. So the Philippines presidential and vice presidential election of 1986 were held on February 7, 1986, popularly known as the 1986 snap election. So ang snap election ay isang proseso ng halalan o paraan ng paghahalal sa EDSA o araw bago ang talagang itinakdang araw nito. Sa sitwasyon ng Marcos administration, nais na ring matapos ng administrasyon ang issue tungkol sa martial law. Kaya kailangan ding magsagawa agad ng snap election at para maipagpatuloy na rin ang pamamahala sa gobyerno na susuportahan ng US sa panahong iyon. So Marcos confident he would win the election with his martial law mechanism gave way. His snap election was held with Marcos' political party, the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, and Cory Aquino with Doy Laurel for the United Opposition or the UNIDO as the opposition party. The Batasang Pambansa or the Congress, the official government agency authorized to canvass the votes of the president and vice president and to proclaim the winning presidential and vice presidential candidates, proclaimed Marcos and Tolentino as winners amidst accusation of rampant frauds perceived to have been committed no less by the Commission on Election to manipulate the election result. Noted in this regards was the observation of the US Congress, which sent official representatives to observe this snap election. According to them, massive election frauds were committed by both sides of the party. So ang election fraud, sometimes referred to as electoral fraud, ay isang taktika sa politika kung saan minamanipulate or minamanipula ang boto ng mamamayan na hindi umaayon o sa madaling salita lumalabag sa nararapat na proseso ng eleksyon. Dahil nga nagkaroon ng supervision ng US Congress sa snap election, napatunayan nila na ang partido ng kasalukuyang administrasyong Marcos at ang oposisyon na pinamumunuan ni Cory Aquino ay lumabag o nandaya sa naisagawang snap election. So, pareha silang nandaya sa eleksyon na iyon ayon sa supervision ng US Congress. Amidst the massive protests wherever in the Philippines, especially in Metro Manila, Ramos and Enrile, in a joint media conference on February 22, 1986, Saturday at 6 p.m. was overheard proclaiming their severance from Marcos government, since they said it was Cory Aquino and Doy Laurel who really won the election. Therefore, Marcos was no longer the legitimate president immediately, but Aquino, the brother of Ninoy, and Cardinal Sin called the people to go to EDSA to support Ramos and Enrile, who were in campaigning at Campo Crame and Campo Ganaldo, respectively. So that the night and until the next day, millions of people went to EDSA. So the said observation was even taken to mean the US last attempt to have Marcos justify official result of this snap election. So the perception that the US was still behind Marcos at that point in time was still prevailing. So meanwhile, Cory Aquino, with the support of the masses, even more condemned Marcos in public. The allegation of massive frauds and the call for civil disobedience to Marcos government were intensified. So dahil nga nanalo ang Marcos administration sa eleksyon na iyon, ay lalo pang napaigting ang kadahilanan na nais ng karamihan na mapalitan na or mapatalsik na ang kasalukuyang gobyerno na pinamunuan ng late President Ferdinand E. Marcos. So unti-unting nagkaroon ng anti-Marcos sentiment. Nagkaroon ngayon ng massive protest sa EDSA at kahit saang lugar man sa bansa, lalong-lalo na sa Metro Manila, sa pamumuno ni Cory Aquino para mapatalsik at mapalitan niya ang kasalukuyang administrasyong Marcos. The indecisiveness of Marcos to take positive steps in resolving issues emboldened the masses to go to EDSA in festive mode, and at the same time weakened the morale of the soldiers who remained loyal to him. Thus, starting the second day of EDSA revolution, soldiers started to defect from their commander-in-chief towards the people. This was done by their group commanders announcing they were leaving Marcos to join the people's cause. So dahil nga naniniwala si Fidel B. Ramos at si Juan Ponce Enrile na si Cory Aquino talaga ang nanalo, nagkaroon din ng pagbabago sa armed forces. So unti-unting lumabag na sa kagustuhan ng pamuno ang Marcos ang mga sundalo to join the People Power Revolution in EDSA. So eto ang naging dahilan para maihalal si Cory Aquino as the new president. So sa panahong ito, naging dalawa ang presidente ng Pilipinas. So that on the fateful Tuesday on February 25, 1986, Cory Aquino took her oath as the president of the Republic as a revolutionary president at Club Filipino, San Juan City, Metro Manila, while Marcos simultaneously also took his oath in Malacanang as re-elected president. For the moment of the Philippines had two presidents. On the night of February 25, 1986, at about 9 p.m., it was heard over the radio that a helicopter landed on the rooftop of Malacanang to bring Marcos to Hawaii. So the falling of health of Marcos, yan yung naging dahilan bakit pumunta siya sa Hawaii, no? Para magpagaling. Thus, martial law finally ended in a peaceful people power revolution at EDSA on January 25, 1986. This is otherwise known in Philippine history as the Yellow Revolution. The lesson of martial law. The lesson of martial law tells us that never again should the same be allowed to in place at any time, anywhere in the country, for whatever reason, so that never again the same atrocities should happen. Moreover, it tells us that the people themselves and no others, by their unified and concerted acts, could liberate them from whatever predicament or oppressive situation they are in, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may be. So besides the EDSA revolution or the EDSA legacy, likewise tells us that not even the most powerful country like the US of America can dictate the fate of the people, even of the poorest country like the Philippines. If the people themselves decide their future because had the Americans been followed, they would have not abandoned Marcos and his martial law. Due to the leverage afforded by Marcos in return of their support. But when the Americans saw the Filipinos were determined to overthrow Marcos' regime, and there was no way to save him and his martial law, the Americans left Marcos and even facilitated his downfall by directly lifting him and his family from Malacanang to Hawaii on that fateful day of February 25, 1986. It paved the way to instill the Cory Aquino government as the new president of the Republic. So in the lesson of martial law, it tells the futuristic accomplishment of the Cory Aquino government. So matutunghayan natin ngayon kung naging tama ba na maihalal si late President Cory Aquino as the new president of the Republic of the Philippines. Dahil nga sa martial law na to at nagkaroon tayo ng EDSA revolution para mapatalsik ang diktadoryang Marcos. Post-martial law era. The assumption to office of Cory Aquino with her revolutionary government that gave her an absolute power to overrule the government in terms of replacing all Marcos people who were perceived as corrupt public officials had given so much hopes, especially the poor, for a better life through an honest, sincere, and uncorrupt government. However, no substantial change had taken place, except change of people in the sense that the government had been dominated by Aquino's cronies, as martial law era was dominated by the Marcos cronies. So sa makatuwid, hindi rin halos nasolusyonan ng Administrasyong Aquino ang kasalukuyang problema ng ating bansa. Ang corruption at kahirapan ay lalo pang lumala sa pamumuno ni late President Cory Aquino. Ang nabago lang niya ay ang mapalitan ang Administrasyong Marcos sa pamumuno niya bilang bagong presidente ng Pilipinas. Sa panahon ng pamumuno ni Cory Aquino, hindi na rin niya sinuportahan ang nasimulang mga plataforma ng dating Pangulong Marcos tulad ng nuclear power plant na kung saan magkakaroon ng mababang singil na kuryente ang lahat ng mamamayang Pilipino at para hindi na umasa sa oligarkiyang Lopez na nagmamayari ng private company na Meralco sa panahong iyon hanggang sa ngayon. So sa pagkawala ni Marcos, ang Meralco na dating nalubi sa kamay ng mga Lopez ay ngayon ay naibenta ulit at muling naibalik sa kanila dahil si Cory Aquino na ang namumuno. Dagdag pa rito, sa pagkawala ni Marcos, hindi na rin naipagpatuloy ang Green Revolution, Blue Revolution na tumutukoy sa pagkakaroon ng sapat na pagkain at sa katunayan, sa panahon din ni Marcos, ang Pilipinas ay kinilala bilang isa sa mga maunlad na bansa sa Asia, nakilala sa pangunahing pinagkukunan ng bigas at iba pang produktong pagsasaka. Marami pang mga gagandang proyekto at plano ang dating Pangulong Marcos. At ilan sa mga ito ay magsapag hanggang ngayon ay tinatamasa din natin mga Pilipino. So hindi lahat ay nahinto sa pagupo ni late President Cory Aquino. So ilan sa mga ito na naibahagi ng dating Pangulong Marcos ay tulad ng libreng edukasyon sa lahat sa paraan ng pagpapatayo sa mga naitayong universidad o universidad sa iba't ibang sulok ng bansa. So during Aquino's time, the poor even became poorer. With the elitist policies of the government continued and the oppression of the poor remained. Contractualization in the labor sector was even institutionalized in the labor code. Ayan. So, pag sinabi natin contractualization, no? So, walang nagiging permanent sa isang trabaho. Kumbaga, makakabenepisyo dito ang mga private company na kung saan merong limited lang na buwan o taon ang isang empleyado at pwede na siyang palitan ng panibagong mga empleyado. That's why it is called contractualization. So, the anti-poor policies were enacted into laws. Pro-poor legislations were supported with restrictive implementing rules so as to make intended beneficiaries impossible to avail of the same. Thus, after about 30 years of the EDSA People Power Revolution, the majority of Filipino people remained poor amidst the claim of material progress by the Pinoy administration. The infrastructures, the commercial establishment, and the increase of the GDP or the gross domestic product, while considered an index of the country development, are not true replica of the people's progress and betterment. The reason is that said material progress is enjoyed only by few business tycoons doing business in the Philippines. So dito na mayani ang oligarkiyang Aquino at pamilyang Lopez na siyang kumukontrol sa mga negosyo o sa mga main businesses dito sa Pilipinas, kagaya ng langis, ng kuryente, ng media at iba't iba pang sektor sa government. The alleged employment opportunity brought about by this foreign investment cannot be considered an advantage to the Philippine people since our employment system is exploitive that even reduced the Filipino workers to slavery right in their own country. So namayani talaga yung kahirapan or yung poverty sa time ni Cory Aquino. So hindi naramdaman ng masang Pilipino ang pagbabagong hinahangad nila dapat sa pamumuno ni late President Cory Aquino. While those who work abroad, even if acclaimed as unsung heroes, are subjected to subhuman slavery. Thus the saying, ang manggagawang Pinoy ay alipin sa sariling bayan at lalong higit na alipin sa lupang dayuhan. So dahil nga sa hirap ng buhay sa Pilipinas sa panahon ni Cory Aquino, no? Lahat ng mga produkto, mga basic needs ay tumaas at nagka-problema sa paraan ng mga Pilipino para magkaroon ng trabaho or employment rate. Kaya karamihan sa mga Pilipino ay nag-ibang bansa. Kahit nga tawagin silang isang bayani, no? Dahil sila ang nagko-contribute ng malaking porsyento ng buwis dito sa Pilipinas, hindi pa rin mapagkakaila na ang manggagawang Pinoy ay alipin sa sariling bayan at lalong higit na alipin sa lupang dayuhan.